She trusted the wild mare no one could tame until the ranch. Hand showed her how to love. The sun-scorched air of the barbed ranch was thick with hopelessness, defiance, and buried grief. Before Cassandra Cass, Riley the wild mare Tempest was a storm of black fury, a whirlwind of muscle and hate, her eyes burning with untamed fire. But Cass had true grit. She yanked the coarse rope, her jaws set like iron, determined to break the beast or die trying, because control was the only thing she had left. For a shattering moment, the mare's defiance wasn't a horse, but a flash of memory. Her brother's small hand slipping from hers, a scream swallowed by the dust. She blinked the ghost away, focusing her rage on the horse. She would conquer this one thing. She had to. From the shadows of the corral, a lone ranch hand watched his eyes, seeing a truth she couldn't. He knew her rawhide tough methods would only lead to ruin for the horse and for her. He had one chance to show her a different way. But would she let him save her from herself before the real storm hit? The dust of the barbed ranch was the color of old blood and forgotten promises. It settled on everything, a fine red powder coating the slumped shoulders of the barn and the cracked leather of Cassandra Riley's gloves. The air itself was thin, choked with the scent of heat and failure. This land, her father's legacy, was a ghost of what it once was, a dying dream under a vast, merciless sky. And in the center of the breaking pen stood Tempest. The mare was not a ghost. She was a living, breathing storm. A whirlwind of black muscle and coiled fury, her coat so dark it drank the sunlight, her eyes burning with an intelligent fire that defied the very notion of conquest. She was the last great prize of the Barbadar, the final untamable piece of a broken kingdom. And Cass was going to break her. She had to. With a grunt, Cass yanked the coarse rope. It was a declaration of war. The knot bit into the rawhide tough wood of the snubbing post, the line singing with tension as it ran to the halter on the mare's head. Tempest didn't bolt. She didn't rear. She simply planted her hooves, lowered her magnificent head, and met the pressure with an unyielding, solid wall of resistance. It was a battle of wills, fought in the suffocating silence of the afternoon heat. Heat shimmered. Hope died. "That's it, you devil," Cass hissed through gritted teeth, her arms straining the muscles in her back, screaming. "You'll learn. You'll all learn." The words were for the horse, but they were born from a deeper, more bitter place. She pulled again, harder this time, leveraging her whole body, her boots digging into the scarred earth. For a moment, the world narrowed to the taut rope and the defiant animal at the other end. Then a voice, quiet as the dust settling, cut through her rage. "A rope can pull a body, ma'am, but it can't pull a spirit." Cass whirled around, her anger flaring. Liam stood by the fence, his form long and lean in the afternoon sun. He hadn't made a sound approaching. He never did. He moved like a shadow, his presence a silent judgment she couldn't stand. He was just a drifter, a hired hand she'd taken on out of desperation, yet his quiet gaze seemed to see right through the fortress she'd built around her heart. "Spirits don't pay the bank, Liam," she snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Breaking this horse does. This is my ranch, my horse, my problem." He didn't flinch. His eyes, the color of a twilight sky, drifted from her to the mare. Tempest was still watching him, her ears pricked forward with an unnerving curiosity. The fury in her stance had softened just for a second. "Is she the problem?" Liam's voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of a far heavier question. Or is she just the mirror? The word struck Cass with the force of a physical blow. A mirror. The accusation ignited a fresh wave of fury because it was true. She saw her own shattered, defiant soul in that horse's wild eyes. She saw the rage she couldn't voice, the grief she couldn't tame. "Get back to mending that fence," she ordered, turning her back on him, refusing to let him see the tremor in her hands. "I pay you to work, not to preach." She heard the soft crunch of his boots as he walked away, the silence he left behind somehow louder than his words. Humiliation burned in her throat. Alone again with the beast, she braced herself, coiling the rope for another attempt. Control. You just need to show her who has control. But as she prepared to pull, the image of the horse blurred, replaced by a memory sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass in the eye. A different field. Greener. A child's laughter. Her brother, small and fearless on the back of a stallion her father had warned was too much for him. Then a sickening lurch, the horse bolting, and her brother's small hand slipping from hers as she tried to grab the reins. A single scream swallowed by the thunder of hooves and the unforgiving dust. Her fault. Her failure to control. Cass gasped, stumbling back, the rope falling slack in her grip. The memory left her, hollowed out, the afternoon sun, suddenly feeling cold. Tempest watched her, the mare's dark eyes seeming to understand. The horse let out a low, soft nicker, a sound that was not a challenge but something else entirely. Something Cass hadn't heard in years. It sounded almost like pity. That night, she couldn't eat. She sat on the rickety porch of the ranch house, a bottle of cheap whiskey her only companion, watching the breaking pen. The fight had drained from her, leaving only a familiar, aching emptiness. She had failed. Again. Then she saw movement. Liam was approaching the pen, not with a rope, but with his hands empty. He didn't enter the corral. He simply leaned against the fence, his silhouette a lonely figure against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. He stood there for a long time in a silence that felt different from the tense quiet of the day. It was a patient silence, a respectful one. Tempest, who had been standing in the far corner, slowly, cautiously began to walk toward him. She stopped a few feet away, her head lowered, her breath misting in the cooling air. And then Liam began to speak. His voice was too low for Cass to make out the words, a soft, rhythmic murmur that was less a human language and more a part of the wind itself. It was a low song, a gentle current of sound flowing into the darkness. He was talking to the horse, not as a beast to be broken, but as an equal. A chill ran down Cassandra's spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Who was this man? This quiet, watchful stranger who spoke in whispers to storms, and what in God's name was he waking up inside her? The sound of his voice was a current in the darkness, a low and steady murmur that seemed to calm the very air. Cassandra stood frozen on the porch, the whiskey bottle forgotten in her hand. She watched as Tempest, the beast of black fury who had fought her with every fiber of its being, took another step toward Liam. Then another. The mare's head was low, her ears soft. She was listening. A raw, unfamiliar jealousy coiled in Cass's gut. It was a bitter thing, sharp and hot. What was this magic? What secret language did this quiet ghost of a man possess that she, the rightful owner, did not? He hadn't used force. He hadn't used a rope. He had used only his voice and a stillness she could never hope to find within herself. She watched until the moon rose high, a sliver of bone white in the ink-black sky, and the two figures in the penman and horse remained locked in their silent communion. The next morning, the confrontation felt inevitable. She strode to the corral, her resolve hardened by a sleepless night. She would not be undone by a drifter's tricks. But when she arrived, she stopped short. The water trough, which she'd left murky, was scrubbed clean and filled with fresh water. In a small pile near the fence lay a handful of wild purple clover, the kind that grew only down by the creek bed. Tempest was nibbling at it delicately. It was an offering. And an offering was a language Cass had long forgotten how to speak. "What spell did you cast on her, Liam?" she demanded, her voice tight as he emerged from the barn. He paused, wiping his hands on a rag. His gaze was infuriatingly calm. "No spell, ma'am. Just silence." He gestured with his chin toward the mare. She was thirsty. "I give her water," Cass retorted, feeling defensive. Childish. Fear makes a lot of noise inside a soul, he said, his eyes meeting hers. There was no judgment in them, only a deep, weary truth. An animal's or a person's. Sometimes you just have to be quieter than the fear. He was a man made of secrets, and she was beginning to fear that his secrets were tangled up with her own. His words echoed in her mind long after he'd gone back to his work. Quieter than the fear. Driven by a desperation she wouldn't admit to, she tried. She unlatched the gate, her heart hammering against her ribs, and stepped inside the pen, leaving the rope behind. She walked to the center and just stood there, her hands hanging awkwardly at her sides. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. To do nothing. To simply be. Every instinct screamed at her to act, to command, to force the situation. Her father's disappointed face flashed in her mind, followed by the terrifying, weightless feeling of her brother's hand slipping from her grasp. Tempest lifted her head, the clover forgotten. She watched Cass, her black eyes unblinking. The air vibrated with tension. Minutes stretched into an eternity. It was not a surrender, not on either side. But it was not a fight. For the first time it was something else. A fragile, unnerving truce. Later that day, the old well pump seized up with a groan of rusted metal, forcing them to work together. The task was physical demanding, and blessedly free of the need for conversation. They worked in a shared rhythm of grunts and strained muscles, the sun beating down on their backs. At one point, a heavy iron gear slipped from its housing and Cass lost her footing. She started to fall backward, but Liam moved with a startling fluid speed, his arm shooting out to steady her, his hand warm and firm against her back. The world stopped for a single heartbeat. They were close, closer than they had ever been. She could smell the sun and sweat on his skin, see the flecks of gold in his twilight eyes. The moment passed as quickly as it came. He released her, stepping back, a flicker of something unreadable on his face. The silence that followed was different. The anger was gone, replaced by a raw, uncertain curiosity. "You didn't learn that quiet way with horses just mending fences," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Where are you from, Liam?" He stared out at the horizon for a long moment, his profile sharp against the endless blue. When he spoke, his voice was distant, heavy with the dust of another life. "I used to think a horse's will was like iron," he said slowly. "Something to be bent into shape, with heat and a hammer." He paused, and a profound sadness settled over him. "I learned, the hard way, that some things don't bend. They just break, and you're left standing there, holding the pieces." He looked at her then, and in his eyes, she saw it. The same haunted look she saw in her own reflection. He was another survivor of a wreck. She couldn't see a man scarred by a grief as deep as her own. Before she could ask more, he turned back to the pump, the wall of silence falling between them once more. But something had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer just a hired hand. He was a kindred spirit. As evening approached, the air grew thick and heavy, smelling of rain and electricity. The sky to the west was bruising, turning a sick violet gray. A low growl of thunder echoed from the distant mountains. A storm was brewing on the horizon, a perfect mirror to the tempest in her own soul. And Cassandra had the terrible certain feeling that when it finally broke, it would be strong enough to sweep them all away. The sky did not darken. It bruised. The air, once thin and hot, turned heavy and cold thick with the electric smell of ozone and damp earth. A low, guttural growl rolled in from the mountains, a sound that vibrated deep in Cassandra's bones. The wind, no longer a whisper, began to shriek, tearing at the loose shingles on the barn roof and whipping the dust into frantic dancing devils. This was not just a storm, it was a reckoning. Liam appeared at her side on the porch, his face grim as he scanned the churning violet-gray clouds. "We should get the horses into the barn," he said, his voice tight, barely audible over the rising gale. "All of them." But it was too late. The world split apart in a blinding, searing flash of white. A crack of thunder followed so closely it felt as if the sky itself had been torn in two. A giant ancient oak tree at the edge of the breaking pen exploded a shower of splinters and fire against the dark sky. The raw, violent power of it stole the breath from Cass's lungs. In the pen, tempest became the storm. Pure, blind terror erased everything else. With a scream that was almost human, a sound of primal fear, the mare launched herself at the fence, not with defiance now, but with the desperate, unthinking force of a creature convinced it was about to die. Old wood splintered, nails groaned and gave way, and she was gone. A black shape swallowed by the driving horizontal rain, a phantom disappearing into the gray curtain of the squall. She was heading for the canyons, the jagged, treacherous maze of rock and shadow where a horse could fall, could break a leg, could vanish forever. No. The word was a choked whisper from Cass. A cold dread washed over her, colder than the rain that was now lashing her face. Another failure, another loss, the familiar story of her life. Then something else rose up, hot and fierce, burning through the icy despair. A protective instinct so powerful it shocked her. Not this one. Not again. She ran from the porch, ignoring Liam's shout, her boots sinking into the mud that was once dust. She burst into the tack room, her hands finding a bridle, her movements clumsy with haste. Cass, don't. Liam grabbed her arm as she led her own saddle horse, a steady buckskin named Anchor, from his stall. For the first time he used her name, and the sound of it so raw and urgent made her pause. You can't ride into those canyons now, it's suicide. She tore her arm from his grasp, her eyes wild. I'm not losing her. Liam, she cried, her voice cracking the carefully constructed walls around her heart, crumbling into ruin. I have lost enough. The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding in the chaotic air. It was the truest thing she had said in years. Before he could answer, she swung herself into the saddle, her face a mask of desperate resolve. She was no longer thinking. She was feeling. And the feeling was a frantic race against the ghosts of her past. She dug her heels into Anchor's sides, and they plunged into the maelstrom. Rain like needles. Wind a scream. Hoofbeats lost in thunder. She rode with a reckless abandon that bordered on madness, her world reduced to the blurred landscape and the faint muddy tracks that were rapidly being washed away. She was chasing more than a horse. She was chasing absolution. She was trying desperately to outrun the memory of a small, still hand in the dust. The trail led her to the mouth of Black Creek Canyon, a narrow, unforgiving slit in the earth. And there she saw her. Tempest was inside her black coat, slick with rain, her body trembling. She was trapped at the far end, where the canyon became a box. But it was worse than that. The mare was hurt. Her left foreleg was bent at an unnatural angle, wedged in a V of fallen rock from a smaller slide. Her eyes were wide with pain and terror. Relief and horror warred in Cass's chest. She slid from Anchor's back, her own legs trembling. "Easy, girl," she whispered, her voice snatched away by the wind. "Easy now. I'm here." She took a step forward. That's when the mountain roared. A deep, grinding crack echoed from high above, a sound of ancient stone giving way. She looked up, her heart seizing in her chest. The rain-soaked canyon wall was moving. A river of mud, shale, and rock was peeling away, sliding down toward the entrance. The rocks fell a final deafening avalanche. The world went dark. She wasn't the rescuer anymore. She was just another prisoner of the canyon, trapped with the very storm she had come to tame. The roar of the avalanche faded, replaced by the hiss of the rain and the frantic, hammering beat of Cassandra's own heart. Dust and the smell of shattered rock filled the air. She was sealed in. The canyon, once a path, was now a tomb. A wave of pure, claustrophobic panic washed over her, and for a moment the only sound in the world was the blood rushing in her ears. She was trapped. She was alone. But she wasn't alone. A pained, terrified scream cut through her fear. Tempest! The mare was struggling, her powerful body contorting in a desperate, futile fight against the rocks that held her leg. Her eyes were white-rimmed, wild with an agony that transcended mere panic. It was the raw, naked suffering of a creature that knew its own magnificent strength was now useless. Seeing that pain so absolute and profound shattered something in Cass. Her own fear, her own self-pity dissolved. This wasn't about control anymore. It wasn't about breaking a beast or proving a point. This was about a life precious and wild, caught in a trap. Remembering Liam's words quieter than the fear, she pushed herself up, her movements slow, deliberate. She had no rope. She had no tools. She had only herself. "Easy, girl," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing against the storm's fury. "Easy now." She held out an open hand, a gesture of peace, of surrender. She took a step. Tempest flinched, snorting, her muscles bunching as if to bolt, but the broken leg held her fast. Another cry of pain tore from the horse's throat. Cass's heart broke with it. "I'm not going to hurt you," she murmured, her voice soft, crooning. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She was close now, close enough to see the deep gash in the mare's leg, the unnatural angle of the bone beneath the skin. She was about to take another step when a voice, sharp and clear, cut through the wind. "Cass, don't get any closer, she'll crush you." She spun around. There, halfway down a treacherous, muddy goat path on the canyon wall, was Liam. He was soaked, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but he was there. He had followed her. He had found a way in. Relief so potent it made her knees weak flooded through her. It was followed instantly by a hot flush of shame. He had come to save her. Again. He scrambled the rest of the way down his landing, jarring but sure. His eyes took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, the rock slide, Cass, the trapped and wounded horse. His face, usually so calm, became a mask of deep, wrenching pain. Her leg. He breathed, his voice hollow. He walked toward the horse, not with fear, but with a kind of grim, terrible reverence. He knelt, his hand hovering over the shattered limb, not quite touching it. "What is it?" Cass asked, seeing the look on his face. It was more than concern. It was a kind of agonized recognition. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the suffering animal. "I've seen this before," he said, his voice a ghost of its former self. "A break this bad? On a horse this wild?" He trailed off, his jaw tight. Finally, he stood and turned to her, his eyes holding the haunted look of a man confessing a mortal sin. "My name isn't just Liam," he said, the words torn from him. "Back east, they called me Liam, the Hammer. Harding. I was the man they hired when a horse was unbreakable. I broke them. With force. With fear. I thought a horse's will was iron, something to be beaten into shape." His voice cracked. "There was a stallion. A white Arabian. All fire and pride. His owner wanted him broken for a race. I pushed him. Too hard. Cornered him in the pen just like you did. He fought back. And in his panic, he did this." He gestured to Tempest's leg, shattered it against the rails. "His spirit was so strong he destroyed his own body to escape me." He looked down at his own hands as if they were poison. "I held the gun. I put him down myself. I broke him, and a piece of me broke with him. I walked away that day, swore I'd never raise a hand to a horse in anger again." The story settled in the small stone space, a confession that explained everything. His gentleness, his patience, his silent judgment of her methods. He wasn't weak, he was atoning. His vulnerability unlocked the final gate in Cassandra's heart, the one that held her darkest secret. "My brother," She whispered the words, tasting like ash. His name was Sam. He was 8. Tears she hadn't shed in a decade began to trace paths through the grime on her cheeks. There was a horse, a big bay gelding. My father said he was too green, too unpredictable, but I dared Sam to ride him. I was supposed to be watching. I held the lead rope. Her breath hitched a sob catching in her throat. The horse spooked. Sam fell. And I just stood there. I froze. He was on the ground and I was holding the rope to an empty saddle. I was the one in control, and I just let go. The storm outside screamed, but the silence between them was louder. 2 broken souls, their truths laid bare in a stone tomb. But in the corner the mare Tempest tried to shift her weight, and a soft whinny of pure agony echoed in the canyon. Liam looked at Cass, his eyes filled with a terrible shared understanding. He slowly, deliberately unholstered the pistol at his hip, the worn metal gleaming dully in the stormlight. They had saved each other's souls. Now could they bring themselves to do the one thing that felt both like a mercy and a final heartbreaking betrayal. The pistol in Liam's hand was not a weapon. It was a verdict, cold, heavy, and absolute. It was the end of the story, a final merciful period on a page of suffering. The click of the hammer being cocked was a sound louder than the thunder, a small metallic crack that seemed to fracture the very air in the canyon. Cassandra watched her breath caught in her throat as Liam's face settled into a mask of profound, grim sorrow, the face of a man who knew the weight of this particular sin. He was going to kill the storm. He was going to kill the mirror. And the pragmatic part of her, the part that had run the ranch with ledgers and hard truths, knew he was right. It was a kindness, a release from a pain she could not imagine. But a different part of her, a newly raw and tender part that had been cracked open by his confession, screamed in silent rebellion. Not again. Not another broken thing. Not another life ended in the dust because we weren't strong enough or smart enough or brave enough to find another way. No. The word was a whisper, but it sliced through the heavy silence with the force of a command. Liam froze his knuckles white on the grip of the Colt. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pained confusion. Cass, look at her. There's no other way. This is a kindness. It's my burden to carry, not yours. He was trying to be noble to shield her from the final ugly act. No, she repeated, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. She took a step toward him, placing her hand gently over his, over the cold metal of the gun. You said your way, the hammer and the heat, it only broke things. My way did too. We're not going to end this story with another gunshot, with another ghost. She looked from his haunted eyes to the suffering mare. There has to be another way. Hope is a stubborn, foolish thing. It was a seed she thought had died in her soul years ago, but here it was, a fragile green shoot pushing its way through the bedrock of her grief. Liam stared at her, then at the horse, then back at her. Doubt warred with the grim certainty on his face. Her leg is shattered, Cass. A clean break is a miracle. A compound fracture on a wild animal, it's a death sentence. Even if we could set it, she'd never stand for it. She'd fight us. She could kill us both in her panic, not with force. Cass insisted, her voice fierce, echoing his own philosophy back at him. With trust. You told me you have to be quieter than the fear, so let's be quiet. For a long moment he just looked at her, this woman of iron and anger who was suddenly speaking a language of impossible faith. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a prayer, he lowered the hammer on the pistol and slid it back into its holster. The choice was made. They would try. What followed was not a rescue, it was a ritual. They moved with a shared, unspoken purpose, their past confessions creating a strange and powerful intimacy. They didn't approach the horse's injury first. They approached her fear. They sat in the mud and the rain just beyond her reach, and they spoke to her. Liam's voice was a low, steady murmur. Cass's was a hesitant, broken hum, a half-remembered lullaby her mother used to sing to Sam when he had a fever. It was a song of quiet fields and peaceful sleep. Tempest watched them, her body trembling, but the wild terror in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a wary, exhausted curiosity. They worked to build the splint. The storm in its fury had provided the tools. They gathered straight, strong branches from the lightning-shattered oak that had washed into the canyon. For padding and bindings, they sacrificed pieces of themselves. Liam tore long strips from his own worn shirt. Cass, without hesitation, ripped the hem from her underskirt, the fine cotton a stark white against the mud. Then came the ordeal. The moment where trust would either solidify or be shattered forever. As Liam held the splintered branches ready, Cass moved to the mare's head. Tempest panicked, her body tensing, a low growl of pain and fear rumbling in her chest. The old Cass would have reached for a rope. The new Cass reached with her soul. She pressed her forehead against the mare's trembling, rain-slick neck. "I know it hurts," she whispered, her own tears mixing with the rain on the horse's coat. "I know you're scared. I am too. But you have to trust us. Just for a moment. Please." She closed her eyes, pouring every ounce of calm, every shred of hope she possessed into that single point of contact. Liam moved in his hands, impossibly swift and sure. There was a sickening crunch as he guided the bone into place. Tempest screamed a sound of pure agony that ripped through the canyon, and her body surged. But Cass held firm, her arms wrapped around the mare's powerful neck, whispering the lullaby, her voice breaking with sobs. "It's okay. It's okay. I've got you. I won't let go." And then it was over. The splint was unbound tight with the strips of their clothing. Tempest shuddered violently, then sagged against the rock wall, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She was exhausted. She was in pain. But she was still. She had allowed it. She had trusted them. As if on cue, the fury of the storm began to break. The screaming wind softened to a mournful sigh. The deluge lessened to a steady, quiet whisper of rain. A pale, watery light began to filter into the canyon, illuminating their small, muddy sanctuary. They had done the impossible. They had faced the storm within and without, and chosen life. But as Cassandra looked from the now-sleeping mare to the towering wall of mud and slick rock that blocked their escape, a new, colder fear took root. They had saved the horse. But who now was going to save them? Of course. Here is the final part of this story from the Wild West, a tale of healing forged in a storm. Part 6. Dawn broke, not with fire, but with a soft apologetic light. The rain had passed, leaving the canyon washed clean, the air smelling of wet stone and new beginnings. The sky was a pale, fragile blue. It was beautiful, and it was a prison. Cassandra, Liam, and Tempest were a small, shipwrecked family on a stone island surrounded by impassable cliffs. The rock slide that blocked the entrance was a mountain in its own right, a tomb door sealed by the storm. They were alive. They were trapped. Liam confirmed it after a grim survey of their cage. "The path I used is gone," he said, his voice flat with the finality of it. Washed away. He looked at their meager resources. A little water in his canteen. No food, and a crippled horse that couldn't move. The silence that followed was not one of despair, but of quiet contemplation. The confessions of the night before had burned away all pretense, leaving only a raw, shared humanity. "I was always so sure," Cass said, her voice a near whisper, as she stared at the wall of rock, "that I could force the world to bend. That if I just held the rope tight enough, nothing bad could ever happen again." Liam came to stand beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. "The world doesn't bend, Cass," he said softly. "It just shows you where you're already broken. The trick isn't learning how to pull harder, it's learning how to heal." He looked up, his gaze tracing a line along the sheer northern cliff face. It was less steep than the others, but it was still a treacherous wall of slick, wet rock. A madman's climb. "I can make that," he said. Cass's heart seized. "Liam, no. You'll fall." Maybe he admitted a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But it's the only hand we've been dealt. I can make it back to the ranch, get ropes, get help. It's a chance." He turned to her, his twilight eyes serious, holding hers. "The only one we have." The old fear, the terror of being left alone, of being the one left behind, clawed at her throat. The memory of her brother's empty saddle, her father's grave. The world had a habit of taking the people she loved. "Don't," she whispered the word fragile with a fear she could no longer hide. "Don't leave me." He reached out his calloused fingers, gently touching her cheek, his touch erasing the cold of the morning. "I'm not leaving you, Cassandra," he said, his voice full of a promise that felt more solid than the rock beneath her feet. "I'm coming back for you. There's a difference." He entrusted her with the canteen and the care of Tempest. He was giving her the responsibility, giving her his trust. It was a weight and a gift. She watched him climb. Every movement was a slow, calculated prayer. His fingers searching for a hold, his boots scraping for purchase. He was a small, determined figure against the vast, indifferent stone. A dislodged pebble would fall, and her heart would stop until she saw he was still moving, still climbing. Up, up, until he was a silhouette against the blue sky, and then he was gone. The silence he left behind was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She was alone. With the horse. With herself. She spent hours sitting with Tempest, changing the damp padding on her splint, murmuring to her. She told the horse stories of her childhood, of the brother she had lost. She spoke of her guilt, her anger, her fear. She emptied the contents of her own broken heart into the quiet air of that canyon. At some point, she reached out and laid a hand on the mare's powerful neck. Tempest, who had once met her touch with fury, did not flinch. Instead, the great horse let out a long, shuddering sigh and leaned into her hand, a profound and simple gesture of acceptance. In that moment, a quiet grace settled over Cassandra. The frantic need for control finally fell away, replaced by a deep, aching peace. It wasn't her fault. She was just a girl, and it was just a terrible accident. She finally, truly forgave herself. Hours later, a shout echoed from the clifftop. It was Liam. The rescue was a slow, arduous miracle. Liam, with the help of 2 other hands from a neighboring ranch, lowered ropes, food, and water. They rigged a harness and painstakingly hoisted Cass up the cliff face. Getting Tempest out was a near impossible feat of engineering, and trust a sling and a system of pulleys and the gentle, constant murmur of Liam's voice. Weeks later, the Barbed R Ranch was quiet. The scars of the storm were healing. In the main pasture, Tempest grazed her splinted leg, mending a slight limp, the only reminder of her ordeal. She was still a wild thing, but now, when Cass approached, she would lift her head and offer a soft nicker of welcome. Cass stood with Liam by the corral fence watching the sunset, painting the sky in strokes of fire and gold. The ranch, once a symbol of her failure, now felt like a sanctuary. "Looks like the storm passed," Liam said, his shoulder brushing against hers. Cassandra looked at him, at his kind, steady face. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. It felt right. It felt like coming home. "It did," she said.